Welcome to a deep dive, one that just might kind of flip your ideas about American history on their head.
Yeah.
We're going to dig into Doris Kearns Goodwin's Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream.
Oh, yeah.
It's a biography that really gets up close and personal with LBJ.
Yeah.
This guy, he was driven by ambition.
Yeah.
But also haunted by insecurity. And in the end, really eaten up by the weight of his legacy.
What makes this this deep dive really interesting is Goodwin's own relationship with LBJ.
Yeah.
Try and picture this. An anti-war activist, right?
Right.
Working right next to the president who made the Vietnam War way bigger.
Yeah.
She's helping him write his memoirs. You're talking about a front row seat to history.
It really is. It's like we're getting to peek behind the curtain of power, to see the man, the real person, not just the myth.
Absolutely.
And to really wrap our heads around all contradictions that made LBJ who he was. We got to go back to his roots.
Yeah.
Back to those early years in rural Texas.
His relationship with his parents, that was like the melting pot where his ambition was forged and his insecurities, they just kind of got etched in.
Right.
He really looked up to his dad, Sam Johnson, a local politician. But he always felt like he had to measure up, like he was never quite good enough. And then his mom, Rebecca, she gave him this really romanticized view of politics, always stressing duty and service.
It is. It's interesting how this idealistic vision really clashes with the reality of how LBJ operated in politics. It's like he was trying to make these opposite forces work together his whole career.
That's it, exactly. He was a master manipulator, but he also really craved like genuine affection. That's that push and pull. That's key to understanding LBJ. Think back to his college days when he led this upset victory for his group, the White Stars. They were up against the big guys on campus, the Black Stars.
Oh, the classic underdog story.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about winning for him, was it?
Right.
It was proving something, outsmarting everyone, showing he was in charge.
He actually he picked his best friend, Bill Deason, to be the face of the campaign because he knew Deason would be more likable. Even back then, LBJ understood how to make things happen behind the scenes. It was like an early preview of the political genius he'd bring to Washington later on.
So then he gets to D.C., working for Congressman Richard Kleberg. What was that like? What kind of political education did he get there?
It wasn't so much an education. It was more like a takeover. Kleberg wasn't really involved. So LBJ basically ran the office. That's how he learned the ropes, how power works, how to build connections, and, well, how to use those connections to his advantage. His relationship with Senator Richard Russell is a perfect example. These guys, they came from totally different worlds, but LBJ saw how influential Russell was, and he carefully built a bond with him that helped his career.
So it sounds like every conversation, even just casual run-ins, they were all calculated moves in this big chess game LBJ was playing.
He was a master strategist, always thinking 10 steps ahead. He just got people, what made them tick, their weak spots, and he used that to get what he wanted. This was really clear when he became Senate Majority Leader.
He really changed that whole role, didn't he?
He did.
He took control, ran the legislative agenda like nobody had before.
Some people called it a one-man show, but LBJ, he insisted he was just getting things done. He was a force, bending the Senate to his will, and he loved the power that came with it. Even during that whole McCarthy era, all that paranoia and suspicion, LBJ navigated it all with that mix of cunning and pragmatism that was so typical of him.
Yeah, he knew how to survive, how to stay ahead of his enemies, and how to use any situation to his advantage no matter what. But this constant drive for power, it had a downside. There was this deep insecurity, this need to be liked, to be validated that always pushed him.
And that need, that fear of failing, that would eventually become his downfall, especially when he became vice president in the shadow of John F. Kennedy.
The vice presidency really put LBJ through the ringer. I mean, here's this guy. He thrives on power, and suddenly he's stuck on the sidelines,
right,
forced to play second fiddle to the charismatic John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, he felt boxed in, frustrated. He never really fit in with the whole, glamorous Kennedy crowd. But then, well, we all know what happened.
Yeah.
JFK's assassination. It was a tragedy, but it thrust LBJ right onto center stage.
It was such a moment of deep national grief, and LBJ, he just had these incredible political instincts. He knew what to do.
Oh.
He comforted the nation. He got Kennedy's cabinet on his side, and he he made himself out to be the guy who would continue JFK's legacy.
But under the surface, under all that talk about unity and keeping things going, LBJ was already kind of shifting things, you know? He was moving towards his own agenda, his own vision for America, the Great Society.
And that was pretty different from the Kennedy years, wasn't it? I mean, JFK, he inspired people with ideals. That whole idea of reaching for the stars. LBJ was more focused on actually making things better for everyday Americans, you know.
He was a master at getting laws passed, a real deal maker. He knew how to get Congress to do what he wanted. Medicare, Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, those were huge achievements, real proof of his skill as a legislator.
It was like a whirlwind, wasn't it?
Yeah.
This flood of bills and programs all aimed at fighting poverty, inequality, and justice. But, I mean, could all that really work alongside the growing trouble in Southeast Asia?
That's the big question, the one that hangs over LBJ's whole legacy. Vietnam, that was the ultimate test. That's where his strengths and weaknesses, his successes and failures all got tangled up together.
At first, he tried to keep the war quiet, almost hidden, right?
Yeah.
He was afraid it would wreck his plans for America.
He really believed in America's special role in the world, in the power of persuasion. He thought he could manage the conflict, keep the communists in check, and make everyone think everything was under control. But Vietnam, it was like quicksand. It was a trap that would eventually swallow his whole presidency.
As the war got bigger, public opinion shifted. And LBJ, he found himself stuck between his own kind of hawkish side and this growing anti-war movement.
It really brought out those contradictions in his personality. He wanted everyone to agree, but he became more and more isolated. He'd lash out at critics, surround himself with people who just said yes to everything. The war was tearing the country apart, and it was tearing LBJ apart, too.
His health got worse, his mood got darker, and that deep-seated fear of failure, the one that had always been there under the surface, it started to take over.
Can you imagine the pressure, the weight of all that responsibility, everyone watching his every move? He was trying to manage every little detail of the war, obsessing over it, but he was losing control of how people saw it.
And it wasn't just the war, was it? The Great Society, his big vision for a better America, that was starting to unravel too.
The economy was sputtering, prices were going up, and the cost of the war was sucking up all the resources that were supposed to go to domestic programs. The agreement LBJ had worked so hard to build, it was falling apart, and his presidency was on the verge of collapse.
It's almost like something out of Shakespeare, isn't it?
Yeah.
A man with so much talent, so much ambition, brought down by his own weaknesses, by thinking he could force the world to do what he wanted.
But even with all the darkness, there's this deep sense of tragedy, too. LBJ really wanted to make a difference, to help ordinary people. But the war in Vietnam, it became his downfall. It messed with his judgment, made his insecurities worse, and in the end, led to his ruin.
It's a story of triumph and tragedy, all mixed together. It reminds us that even the most powerful people can't escape the forces of history, and that wanton power, even for good reasons, can have terrible consequences. We left off with LBJ at this crossroads. You know, his presidency is falling apart under the weight of Vietnam. His plans for America are fracturing. So what happens? I mean, this is the master manipulator, the guy who always pulled the strings. What happens when he comes up against something he can't control?
Well, he makes a decision that just shocks the whole country. March 31st, 1968, LBJ gets on TV and announces he won't run for re-election. You can just imagine, right? Total disbelief. This is Lyndon B. Johnson, the man who seemed like he was born for power, and he's walking away from the highest office in the land.
What led him to that? I mean, was it like a sudden realization, you know, seeing that the war couldn't be won? Mm-hmm. Or was it something deeper, like he was wrestling with his own inner demons or something?
Goodwin. She thinks it was a bunch of things all coming together at once. The pressure of the war never letting up, his approval ratings in the tank, feeling like even his own party was turning against him. It all just wore him down. He missed the Senate, you know? Back then, he felt like he was really in charge.
So he goes back to his ranch in Texas, hoping to find some peace.
Yeah.
And maybe, use his memoirs to kind of change how people saw his time as president.
But he couldn't find any peace. Those ghosts of his past, the anxieties that had always been there, they wouldn't leave him alone. He became obsessed with controlling every little thing on the ranch. He was desperately trying to hold on to some kind of order in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control.
There's this really sad story in the book about LBJ going to some White House ceremony.
Yeah.
And he feels totally lost, out of place. He sees President Nixon being celebrated, but in reality, it's actually Vice President Agnew.
That just shows how warped his thinking had become, how deep those feelings of resentment and failure had settled in. He just couldn't escape the shadow of the war, the weight of the choices he made. It haunted him right up until the end.
And then LBJ dies, January 22nd, 1973, just one day after they announced the ceasefire in Vietnam. A heart attack, all alone in his bedroom at the ranch. It's almost like he couldn't face a world where the war was finally over, a world where he wasn't president anymore.
It's such a tragic ending to a life that was both really complicated and really important. Lyndon B. Johnson, he was a flawed hero, a man with huge talent and ambition who did some amazing things but was ultimately brought down by his own weaknesses.
His story, it's a powerful reminder about how limited power really is, how seductive ambition can be. And it shows us the complicated truth behind the American dream. It makes us think about the kind of leaders we want, the price we pay for power, and how to balance ambition with doing the right thing.
If you want to really understand this fascinating and kind of tragic figure, you got to read Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's a book that really gets into leadership, legacy, what it means to be human.
And you can find a link to buy the book in the show notes. And while you're there, go ahead and subscribe to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. We do more deep dives into the lives and minds of some of history's most interesting people. Thanks for listening.